28. Security crime and immigration. Talking about security crime and the correlation of these two issues with the phenomenon of migration is perhaps the most effective way in order to be called racist or fascist. Indeed, among the most recently discussed subjects, this one is the most sacred taboo of recent progressivism, another argument which, when it is not completely overlooked, is examined with vague and ideological biased analysis. In his Corsair writings, Pasolini wrote that the intellectual courage of truth and political activity are two incompatible things in Italy. Personally, I do not love the words courage and truth. They are terribly slippery and should be used sparingly. In their place, I'd replace intellectual secularism, that is, the mental disposition of those who believe that there are no topics of public interest that should be excluded from free debate, provided that the debate is disciplined and rigorous, and that there are no indisputable authorities or truths. I'd rather place truth with reality of factual data or only with reality. Besides this, the thought of Pasolini is shareable and fits perfectly with our case. In order to maintain the appearance of consistency of ideas and values, left-wing parties prefer to give up the analysis of the criminal phenomenon and uncritically marry a formula or theorem handed down for generations. Among the most widespread formulas to explain delinquency, the main one argues that men are delinquent because they are forced by poverty. Although poverty is related to crime, and later we will go into more detail, being poor is neither a sufficient condition for committing crimes, only a very marginal part of the poor commits crimes, nor a necessary condition. Not all crimes suffer conditions of poverty indeed. This approach has fair roots that even go back to Marx. It derives from the idea that material reality, in this case the lack of well-being, inevitably induces people to make certain decisions and acts to commit crimes, making them in fact puppets solely moved by the surrounding reality. This approach is also called determinism in the sense that material conditions automatically determine the thoughts and actions of men. In the 19th century, determinism was so fashionable that it inspired the literature current of naturalism in France, with Émile Zola as its highest representative, and partly of Verismo in Italy. It goes without saying that such an approach attributes the ultimate reason of criminality to the current socio-economic system, especially to the capitalistic system, guilty of making men envious first and criminals then. This implies that at least two ideological operations. The first one is to deny individual responsibility, that is, the fact that the individual is able to make choices autonomously based on his own values and principles. The second one, apparently in opposition, is to neglect the sociable nature of man, namely the relation, affective, social, cultural side, which contribute to the formation of personality, and which very often have little or nothing to do with economic or political system in which they are inserted. Now, even with the inevitable variations and modifications due to historical changes, the approach to the problem of most communist and socialist parties has remained the same, essentially deterministic. It followed that the criminal was seen more as a victim of a system than as a disturbing element. Crime, therefore, as the understandable response to a state, to a system that does not help, rather oppresses. Even my beloved Fabrizio De André, an Italian singer-songwriter who called himself an anarchist, fell once into this nonsense. In 1998, he said that if in the southern regions of Italy, of course, there was not organized crime like mafia and 'ndrangheta and Camorra, unemployment would probably be much higher. Today, in an almost invariable way, this conception of delinquency is applied to the new last ones and oppressors of the system, migrants. On the contrary, I would say that this conception was strengthened because it was linked to another declared cornerstone of the left, anti-racism, a theme on which it would be appropriate to dedicate an article, given the many trivializations, distortions, and spurious intertwining with issues that have little to do with the fight against racism, including communitarianism and multiculturalism. According to an unwritten leftist dogma, immigrants are a positive phenomenon, period. Immigrants do not pose a security threat, and if they do, however, it is because they are forced by poverty. Hence, the problem that the reader has already guessed. If security disappears from the political agenda of the left, it becomes an exclusive topic of the right, or, as it currently happens in Italy, of the extreme right of the League Party, a right-wing, security, paranoid, anti-immigrant, xenophobic, and let's say so, less sensible to anti-racism. And so, when security becomes a priority issue for the electorate, the left loses a considerable portion of votes. What are you proposing, Alberto? Someone will object. Are you proposing mimicking the right? The answer is no. The answer is that security is a central theme of progressivism, guiltily overlooked, and this for two reasons. The first is that the lack of security and delinquency affect in a negative way more the middle-low classes than the middle-high ones, as shown by two leftist criminologists, John Lear and Jock Young, in What is to be Done About Law and Order of 1948. The second is that security is inextricably linked to the topic of individual freedom. In fact, he who sees his person threatened as well as his beloved ones and his property is a person who enjoys a limited freedom. Those who live in fear suffer in fact an oppression and a restriction of their thoughts, desires and actions. More simply, freedom also means walking on the streets at any time of the night in any neighborhood without the worry that something unpleasant may happen. We end here for now the ideological framing of this issue in the progressive field, and we try rather to go into the data. What is the real situation in Italy? How are we doing in terms of security compared to other countries? And what is the contribution of the immigrant population? First of all, it must be said that Italy is a safe country, but not very safe. Among the few sources available for a data that put together more criteria and compare most of the countries of the world, my choice fell on the Global Peace Index, a study published every year since 2007 by the Institute for Economics and Peace. This study aims to assess the level of pacificity of over 160 countries. The judgment ranges from a minimum of 1, which is maximum pacificity, to a maximum of 5, very low pacificity. The evaluation combines the assessments of 3 categories of indices, one of which is called societal safety and security. For this category, there are 10 indices: level of perceived crime in society, the number of refugees and displaced persons as a percentage of the total population, political instability, the level of political terrorism, the impact of terrorism, the number of murders per 100,000 inhabitants, the level of violent crime, the likelihood of violent demonstrations, the number of prisoners per 100,000 inhabitants, the number of armed services personnel for 100,000 inhabitants. Now, taking into account this single assessment, Italy is ranked 49th at the bottom of the first most virtuous third of the countries considered, with a score not really exciting of 2.19, just below the United States and Madagascar, and just above Botswana and Indonesia. The result is quite surprising, since in 2017, Italy ranks among the most peaceful countries in the world in terms of intentional killings, with a rate of just 0.67 homicide per 100,000 inhabitants, against, for example, Germany 1.18, the United States 5.35 and Russia 10.82. Italy is indeed less safe if we consider voluntary injuries. According to data from the United Nations Office for Drug Control and Crime Prevention, in 2015, Italy has a rate of 107 cases of injuries per 100,000 inhabitants, one of the highest in Europe. The United States of 238.8 and Russia just 18.92, which, when compared with the homicide rate, means that when someone in Russia decides to injure someone else, he has very often the intention of killing. More generally, the document Committed Crimes and Victims of Crimes, published in 2017 by ISTAT, the National Statistical Institute of Italy, but refer to the year 2014, informs us that in Italy 2,812,000 crimes were recorded. That is, violations of a certain gravity, distinct from the misdemeanors, which is roughly equivalent to 4,650 crimes recorded per 100,000 inhabitants. It is inferred that in 2014, roughly 4 every 100 citizens filed a complaint for a crime. Data analysis typically focuses on the types of offences most frequently committed against the person, such as voluntary personal injury or threats, and against property, such as home burglaries or break-in thefts, which account for 81% of the total, but also those of social relevance, such as stalking, sexual violence, murder, and attempted murder. Another particular interesting figure is the clearance rate. That is, the percentage of suspected perpetrators of the crimes that have been detained with respect to total registered offences. Most of the crimes committed are in fact attributed to unknown persons. Depending on the type of crime, the clearance rate is higher or lower. For example, in 2014, the clearance rate is particularly high for attempted murders because the victim can recognize the author, 83%, while it is extremely low for other types of crime, such as home burglary, which is only 2.7%. And it is also useful to remember that clearance rates can vary greatly from region to region and from city to city. The clearance rate is generally very high in northern Italy, 77%, while it is quite low in the south, 44%, with negative peaks in the city of Naples, where it was only 16%, a disparity that is probably due to the greater presence in the south of organized crime and to the culture of the Code of Silence. The rate of the accused person born in Italy on the total population is also not homogeneous. Here, both crimes and contravention and misdemeanors are taken into consideration. On page 19 of the aforementioned ISTAT report, we read that compared to an average of 908 defendants per 100,000 inhabitants, Calabria, Campania, and Sicily have respectively rates of over more than 1,500, while among the most vicious regions there are Valle d'Aosta, Veneto, and Trentino with rates under 400 respectively. Anyway, it is enough to explain this inhomogeneity by saying that the south is poor while the north is rich. No, in my opinion, it is not enough, but it is undeniable that poverty still plays an important role. And now we come to the contribution of the population of non-native Italians. For clarity, it is good to remember that non-native are all considered immigrants. And of these, those who do not have Italian citizenship are called foreign immigrants or only foreigners, and constitute the vast majority of non-native Italians, equal to 5,145,000 in 2017, or 8.5% of the total population. The data we use now are taken from the Sole 24 Ore article The Map of Crimes Committed by Foreigners in Italy, la mappa dei reati commessi dagli stranieri in Italia, dated September the 28th, 2017, and related to a report of the Ministry of the Interior for the period 1 August 2016, 31st July 2017. Out of a total of more or less 840,000 reports referring to people reported or arrested, the number of foreigners, immigrants without Italian citizenship, therefore, amounts to 241,000, equal to 28.8% of the total, a slight decrease compared to the previous year, as the percentage touched 30%. This means that foreigners are overrepresented compared to Italian natives and to immigrants with Italian citizenship. Dividing the numbers of those reported or arrested for the number by the number of relative populations, it roughly results a crime propensity of 1.1% for natives and non-native with Italian citizenship against 4.7% for foreigners. The latter figure should be, however, corrected downwards for one reason. The 3/4 of those who commit crimes belong to an age group between 18 and 49 years, and it goes without saying that the elderly population among foreigners is very underrepresented. It follows that the propensity rate should be corrected downwards, say, with a good approximation to 3.5%. It should not be corrected with reference to the distribution of sexes. Males, will it be because of testosterone, commit more than 80% of total crimes, and this percentage still rises if crimes such as insults and threats are excluded. Crimes that have little to do with physicality. Yes, we can safely say that if males didn't exist, we would live in a much safer society. But as I said, if we consider the total foreign population, a substantial gender equality is appreciated, as it is the case for the rest of the population. If instead we refer to specific nationalities, then things can vary a lot. According to the ISTAT report, for example, in 2014, the rate of masculinity is minimal for the Ukrainians, just 26 men every 100 women, while it is maximum for the Senegalese, 266 males every 100 women. But let's go back to the chart for a moment. The incidence of foreigners varies widely depending on the crime considered. The only crime in which foreigners are underrepresented is usury, 5.5%. Otherwise, the percentage are always higher than 8.5% of the reference population, with peaks for the exploitation of prostitution, 51%, thefts, 40%, sexual violence, 37.5%, and drugs, 36%. But to complete the picture, there is a crucial data to add, totally ignored. We know that dynamics and the spread of crimes have remained substantially unchanged in recent years in Italy, and that a slight decrease in the total number of crimes has been appreciated. This makes it possible to use the 2014 data with good approximation for 2017. The ISTAT report states, I quote, "About 1/5 of the reported crimes have a foreigner or a foreign citizen per victim, but the percentage is much higher for violent crimes with respect to predatory crimes." End quote. It is highly probable that the real percentage of foreign victims is well over 20%, given that factors such as the minor knowledge of their rights or the administrative irregularity of their position can substantially determine a lower propensity to report the crimes suffered. We conjecture, in short, that the percentage of foreign victims is closer to 25% than not to 20%, and in even this case, we are in the presence of a strong overrepresentation of foreigners. This fact confirms confirms what has been mentioned above, namely that the most disadvantaged and marginalized classes suffer most from crimes, and it should make progressive parties think about the need to seriously include security among the priorities of their political agendas. But let us now focus on why in Italy foreigners commit more crimes than Italian citizens. The first thing to remember is that immigration is not in itself a cause of increasing crime rate. Just to give an example, it is widely proved that in the United States the immigrant population does not commit crimes more than the native one. Indeed, many studies suggest that immigrants have a propensity to delinquency even less than that of the natives. See, for example, the Integration of Immigrants into American Society, published in 2015. With this, we refute not only the idea that immigrant equals criminal, but also that immigrant equals naturally more inclined to delinquency. So, how can we explain this greater propensity to crime on the part of foreigners in Italy? As for any human phenomenon, the causes are very numerous and complex. Here we will present some data and approaches of recent and less recent criminology in order to provide possible partial answers. It goes without saying that what will be said can in some cases be used to explain the different propensity to crime among the natives of northern and southern Italy. In his article, Crime and Immigration in Italy, Crimine e Immigrazione in Italia, published by the Hume Foundation, Luigi Solivetti, professor of sociology at the Sapienza University of Rome, cites some particularly significant economic data: the high average unemployment rate, the high level of economic inequality, the labor market rigidity, and the low level of the country's economic freedom, all unfavorable aspects to integration and economic well-being of immigrants. The strain theory, inaugurated by the American sociologist Robert Merton with his book Social Theory and Social Structure, 1949, is perhaps the one that can best help us to link the economic data listed above with the issue of crime. According to Merton, the gap between social goals and values, on the one hand, and the means to achieve them, on the other, tends to increase deviance from norms. In our case, regarding the socially accepted goal of achieving economic well-being, the unemployment rate, the rigidity of the world of work, the income inequality, and the lack of social mobility constitute impediments and therefore induce some, the so-called innovators, to commit crimes to evade them and obtain financial security, to have been clear. It is therefore inferred that poverty is not in itself a cause of crime. Rather, it is relative poverty. That is, poverty in a context of great social injustice, in which the many have little and the very few have much, which induces social envy. Wealth inequality is also possibly correlated with violence. Where there are large inequalities of wealth, high murder rates and high voluntary injuries rates are usually appreciated. 1. If, on the one hand, it is desirable to promote social policies of redistribution and improvement of working conditions, as well as economic policies aimed at supporting employment, on the other hand, common sense would require limiting migratory flows during the negative economic cycles when unemployment is high and the chances of finding a decent job are few. The rhetoric of the immigrants do the jobs that the Italian no longer want to do Besides being of a discriminatory nature and therefore reprehensible, is worth very little considering the degree of exploitation of many foreign workers in Italy, phenomenon at least partly due to the great competition among the unemployed, which is exploited by unscrupulous employers. Another theory that helps to understand the phenomenon of crime is the so-called theory of social control, whose most famous exponent was the American sociologist Travis Hirschi. The proponents of this approach believe that relationships, commitments, engagements, values, and religious beliefs of the individual constitute an impediment to deviating behavior. This means that those who adhere to the model code shared by the community to which they belong will be less likely involved in criminal activities. This theory goes hand in hand with the idea that involvement of individuals in society and in the public life fosters behaviors that comply with the rules. In the aforementioned text, What is to be Done About Law and Order by Leah and Young, a key concept is marginalization. The less you are politically represented and socially integrated, the more the propensity to crime will increase. In this case, the great propensity to crime of foreigners can be explained at least in part because they tend to be less socially and politically involved in the community or in the country of arrival, and therefore have fewer links and fewer impediments to criminal activities. It is no coincidence that immigrants with Italian citizenship, and I quote the article of Professor Solivetti, have lower crime rates than foreigners. And perhaps it is no coincidence that where, as in the United States, the share of naturalized immigrants on the total immigrant population is substantial, roughly 20 million out of 42, and obtaining citizenship is easier than in other countries. For example, in Italy it takes at least 10 years of residence, in the United States just 5. The crime rate of immigrants is much lower. In the future, the implementation of a law that favors the naturalization of minors born and raised or only raised in Italy, the so-called law of Ius Soli, is not just a battle for a just cause that certain cowardice on the left and certain senseless paranoia on the right are inexplicably and unworthily procrastinating, but perhaps it would also be partly a battle for a less criminal society, insomuch as more cohesive and inclusive. But let's go further. A theory of crime worth mentioning is the theory of social disorganization, aimed at explaining above all the phenomenon of street crime. It was developed in the late 60s by Clifford Shaw and Harry McKay, two members of the so-called Chicago School, the line of studies in which they are inserted as a rather deterministic approach. It was born from the idea that the urban environment in which people live influences their behavior. The Chicago School is also called the ecological school. It uses the Darwinian concept of ecology, that is, the study of the processes that animals and plants undertake to adapt to the surrounding environment. According to Shaw and McKay, the work is Juvenile Delinquency and Urban Areas, 1969, neighborhoods that combine three very specific characteristics, namely physical dilapidation, poverty, and population heterogeneity, have high rates of crime. The heterogeneity of the population means not only that the presence of different national groups, but more in general a constantly changing composition. This last criterion recalls closely the theory of social control mentioned above. It implies that in a neighborhood where the inhabitants barely know each other and do not have moments of socialization, there is a lack of any internal organization and, with it, of social control carried out by the adults towards youth. Hence, a vicious circle rises because the deviant behavior of the youth takes on the traits of a set of values, a subculture, which is transmitted to younger generations. The two scholars have highlighted how the delinquency rates of the areas at risk remain constant regardless of the composition of the population or they change over time. Recognizing in this data the confirmation that the environment is the main factor of street crime. How this approach can be useful to explain the delinquent phenomenon of foreigners in Italy is very uncertain to me. It can perhaps prove profitable to analyze the criminality of the difficult neighborhoods of big cities like Naples, Palermo, Rome, and Milan, and others. But more generally, if it is true that urban degradation is a problem in itself and should be therefore addressed in any case, on the other hand, it is true that in Italy the ghetto district is not a generalized and relevant urban phenomenon as in the United States or in France, where the violent protests of the banlieue of 2005 occurred not by chance. Yet, the study by Shaw and McKay shows a particularly interesting small crack. The rule for which the crime rate remains unchanged regardless of the composition of the population and national groups was inconsistent in one case, when the majority ethnic group was Asian, to be precise, Japanese. In that case, in fact, crime rates dropped drastically. If a strong thesis of the study of the two sociologists tend to exclude the cultural factors as cause of the delinquent phenomenon, the exception given by the Asian population has the air of a disproof. With this starting point, we add a further consideration to our discourse. If divided by nationality, rates of propensity to crime vary a lot. More, rates also vary a lot according to the crimes examined. In other words, members of some nationalities are more at risk than others depending on the various crimes. The article Crime and Migrants, here almost all data, criminalità e migranti, ecco quasi tutti I dati, of the Sole 24 Ore, which is this newspaper, of the 4th September 2018, is a good source of reliable data. The interactive graph allows to consult the complaints by year and nationality. A larger circle corresponds to a great number of complaints, and a darker color corresponds to a greater ratio between complaints and the reference population, thus a greater propensity to a given crime. Just to give some examples, in 2016 there is a rate of complaints for drug dealing equal to 3.35 per 100 for Tunisian citizens, 1.39 for Moroccan citizens, 0.72 for Albanian citizens, 0.1 for Chinese citizens, 0.05 for Romanian citizens, a lower figure also compared to the natives, 0.07. But if we consider another crime, for example the exploitation of prostitution, the picture changes significantly. 85.9 reported per 100,000 for Chinese citizens, 46.6 for Albanian citizens, 33.6 for Romanian citizens, 11.5 for Tunisian citizens, 3.9 for Moroccan citizens. The table below is taken from the already quoted ISTAT report and compares the defendants of the 5 most relevant nationalities in terms of crime. For each nationality, the 8 most common crimes are attributed together with the percentage of defendants compared to the total of foreign defendants for that given crime. I know it is a little bit complex. But anyway, for example, if for Albanians, Moroccans, Tunisians, the most common crime is the production and dealing of drugs, for the Romanians it is simple and it is theft, while for Chinese citizens it is the omitted payment of social security taxes. Now, the question, very thorny, is How do we explain these variations in deviance from the rules, since all the possible partial causes provided so far are valid for all nationalities in the same way? Even in this case, there is no single answer. However, some hypotheses of partial answers can be made. Our first hypothesis, very trivial of course, is that every foreign citizen stands to attend his fellow countrymen, and where he is induced to commit crimes, he most likely ends up in criminal activities already established in his national group. In other words, the most common crimes committed by a national group are such because they aggregate by preference members of the same nationality. Another possible answer is that the same criminal organization, ethnically connoted, foster the immigration of members of the same nationality in order to grow in number, which has the effect of increasing the prosperity of the propensity to the crime of a certain nationality. But if these hypotheses can help to explain the continuity with which certain nationalities have a notable propensity for a certain type of crime, they do not explain why they are originally preferred, why there are preferred activities to respect to others. Okay, a possible answer lies in the set of norms of social customs shared by a national group, in what is commonly called culture. It is reasonable to hypothesize that a culture justifies or tolerates certain behaviors which in other cultural or regulatory contexts are considered deviant or uncensurable. To ask this question, there was a line of research under the name of Theory of Cultural Conflict, born in the 30s in the United States, and whose most important exponent was Johan Torsten Selling, an American sociologist of Swedish origin. In an era that was still deeply racist, in which the deviant behavior of immigrants was attributed to their presumed genetic inferiority, the approach of the cultural conflict instead explained those behaviors on the basis of a set of norms and habits different from those of the host country. In the article Culture, Conflict and Crime of 1938, Selling mentions, I quote, the typical norms that in different social groups govern conduct in life situations, involving, for instance, the defense of personal honor, the taking of life, the relation of the sexes, marital relationships, parent-child relationships, the appropriation of the property of others, the relations of the person to the government as variable, end quote, as variable capable of providing a justification for criminal actions. Ironically, these studies were also born to analyze and combat the crimes committed by Italian immigrants, especially from southern Italy. The Americans took it a while to understand that for some immigrants the crime of honor was a perfectly lawful custom, as well as the abduction of a girl to force her to the marriage, the so-called fuitina, little flight. Even more time was needed for Americans to understand the mafia phenomenon and to adopt effective strategies to combat it. Here, perhaps, the mafia is probably the most appropriate object in order to grasp the link between culture and crime, at least for us Italians. In this regard, Judge Giovanni Falcone said very appropriately, I quote, "The mafia, I repeat it once again, is not a randomly proliferated cancer on a healthy tissue. It lives in perfect symbiosis with a myriad of protectors, accomplices, informers, debtors of all kinds, intimidated or blackmailed people who belong to all the strata of society. This is the soil of Cosa Nostra culture, with everything that has direct and indirect implications with it, conscious or not, voluntary or obligatory, which often enjoy the consent of the people." In other words, the mafia is the mafia, and not just a criminal organization, because it receives material and moral support even from those who are not part of it. And this is why it is so difficult to eradicate. It enjoys a solidarity network that ranges from those who are actively involved to those who suffer it without rebelling. The mafia has been, and still is, strong because it was inserted with a certain coherence in a cultural context, that is, in a set of shared values. That said, it is not worth saying that only few Sicilians belong to the mafia if those who contrasted it practically and ideologically were only a few exceptions, while the rest passively accepted the state of affairs. I use the past tense partly because I tend to be optimistic and partly because the mafia phenomenon has objectively lost a lot of its strength. And if this happened in Italy, it is not just because the state has intervened through the judiciary power and the police, but also because the mafia has been fought with the culture of illegality promoted by the school and by civic associations such as Libera or Addio Pizza. And how can these considerations help us with regard to crimes committed by foreigners? Once again, in the sense of integration, is it so absurd to think that alongside compulsory courses of Italian language, integration can also be cemented by civics courses in which we talk about laws, norms, and custom issues? In Norway, starting from 2009, a project has been launched which has provoked numerous controversies: non-compulsory courses for migrants and refugees on the sexual habits of the host country, a measure aimed at reducing the number of cases of rape and sexual harassment of non-natives. Over time, the lesson, lasting 4 hours in total, included discussions on other topics: how to relate to the other sex, domestic violence, what to do if you're witnessing an episode of sexual violence. As you can imagine, there have been many criticisms. The program has been accused of stigmatizing refugees and foreigners as potential rapists. Indeed, the defenders of the project replied that integration, first of all, passes from the conscious and responsible sharing of norms and customs of the host society, and that the first step is precisely to know them and therefore to talk about them. If we consider that Norway is one of the most generous countries in the world in terms of reception of migrants, over 16% of the population is immigrant, twice as much as in Italy in percentage, it is to believe that the initiative is the result of an inclusive approach rather than a discriminatory one. This experience will now allow us to draw a conclusion. The theories and approaches to crime treated so far are all united by the idea that external factors, whether material, such as economic conditions or urban degradation, or immaterial, such as social control and cultural values, can determine deviant behavior of men. These are theories that aim to identify general trends and which clash with the simple observation that, regardless of the external factors, those who commit crimes are always few people who make a very specific choice. These are theories, therefore, that have the defect of losing sight of the individual. If we believe in the universality of the human condition, if we believe in democracy as a form of collective management of power, then in principle we cannot but believe in individual responsibility and in the fact that the individual is ultimately driven by the rationality of his own decisions. Who commits crime chooses to do so because he considers it useful for his own well-being, to his own happiness. Which does not mean, mind you, that every rational choice is a perfectly conscious choice. This is the utilitarian approach of that genius of Cesare Beccaria, author of De Delitti delle Pene on Crimes and Punishments and father of criminology, the most famous and influential Italian illuminist outside the national borders, a true progressive. At a time when justice was ineffective, arbitrary, approximate, cruel and vindicative, Beccaria insisted on the need to introduce more human prison sentences which should be proportionate to the crimes committed. Beccaria believed that the prison sentence had the dual purpose of freeing the society of dangerous subjects and of acting as a deterrent to potential criminals. For Beccaria, I quote, "It is better to prevent crimes than to punish them. This is the main purpose of all good legislation, which is the art of leading man to the maximum of happiness or to the least possible unhappiness." End quote. And the best way to prevent crimes is to make the individual more aware of the laws that govern the society he belongs to, and of the consequences of his actions, so that he can make the most advantageous decisions possible for himself and for others. Or, as Cesare Beccaria would say, I quote, "Finally, the safest but most difficult means of preventing crimes is perfect education." End quotes. For everyone, I say, Italians and foreigners. Thank you very much. Ciao.